Why did God scatter humanity at the Tower of Babel? Was it just about a tall building? Or a language problem? Or was something much deeper happening? Something that still shapes our world today. In this video, we're going to explore the real reason behind Babel, what mankind was truly building, and why God had to intervene not just to stop them, but to protect his redemptive plan. What was the tower really about? Let's begin in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 4. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. They said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Notice the intention. They weren't trying to reach heaven to worship God. They were building a name for themselves. They were centralizing human power, unifying under man's authority, not God's. The word used for name here is Shem, a word that also refers to reputation, authority, or legacy. In other words, this wasn't just about survival or community. This was about constructing a man-made kingdom that could stand independently from God. Rebellion through unity. This wasn't the first rebellion. In Genesis 3, mankind rejected God's definition of good and evil. In Genesis 4, Cain tried to approach God on his own terms. By Genesis 6, humanity had filled the earth with violence and corruption. And after the flood, God gave a new command. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Genesis 9:1. But what did they say at Babel? Let us build a city, so that we may not be scattered. This was direct resistance. They didn't want to be scattered because they didn't want to spread God's image. They wanted to consolidate their own image. Their unity wasn't for righteousness. It was for control. One language, one city, one tower, one system of man without God. What was this tower? Many scholars believe the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat, a stepped temple used in ancient Mesopotamia. Ziggurats weren't observatories or lookout towers. They were religious structures meant to connect heaven and earth. They were believed to be places where the gods would descend to meet man. So what does that mean? The tower wasn't just about power or fame. It was a false gateway to heaven, an attempt to control the divine, to replace worship with ritual, to bring God down on their own terms. Just like Adam and Eve took the fruit to gain wisdom without obedience, just like Cain offered crops without humility, now mankind was building a religious system without submission. Why God had to stop it? Genesis 11:6 says, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them." This isn't about fearing human innovation. This is about the power of united rebellion. God saw what they were building, a system where man no longer needed him, a civilization that could organize, control, and govern itself without God's law, God's presence, or God's mercy. So he scattered them, not to punish, but to protect them from building a world that would become irredeemable. Scattering was not destruction, it was mercy. The beginning of nations and the corruption that followed. Deuteronomy 32:8 tells us something shocking. When the Most High divided up the nations, he fixed their boundaries according to the number of the sons of God. This means after Babel, God assigned the nations under the oversight of spiritual beings, what Scripture later calls principalities and powers. But they rebelled too and led the nations into idolatry. That's why Psalm 82 shows God rebuking these beings. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? And that's why in Acts 17, Paul says, God determined the appointed times and boundaries of the nations so that they would seek him. Even in judgment, God was planting a path back to him. Scattering wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the long redemption. God's hidden plan, Abraham. Right after scattering the nations in Genesis 11, Genesis 12 begins with a promise to one man. Leave your country, and I will make you into a great nation, and all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. While the nations went their own way, God started a quiet plan through Abraham. Out of one man came Israel. Out of Israel came the Messiah. And through Jesus, God began calling all nations back to himself. That's why in Acts chapter 2, during Pentecost, God reversed Babel, at least in part. People from every nation heard the disciples speaking in their own languages, praising God. Different languages, but one Spirit. Scattered nations, but one gospel. So why did God scatter the people at Babel? Because man's unity had become rebellion. Because the tower was not just a building, it was a declaration of independence from God. Because centralized human power without submission to divine authority leads to corruption, oppression, and idolatry. God's judgment was a warning, but his scattering was also a setup for redemption. Because even when humanity tried to replace him, God was still working behind the scenes to bring us back.